Yeah, you're good.
All right. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the topic of my master's thesis, which is on Shepard's account of what we can know of the external world. And while she develops this as an anti-skeptical response to Hume, she also develops a case for the unknowability of essences, which has been kind of neglected, a position I call epistemic humility. So in this presentation, I'm going to be emphasizing this neglected area of her epistemology, namely her case for the unknowability of essences. So for her epistemic humility. So my talk is going to be structured as follows. So because she's a quite unknown figure in the history of philosophy, I was thinking of beginning with a little bit of brief biographical background about who Shepard was. And then in part 2 of my presentation, I'm going to sketch out my interpretation of Shepard's account of what we can know of things external to the mind. And I'm specifically going to emphasize here how she argues for this kind of epistemic humility. Then lastly, I'm going to round off with some reflections on how this form of epistemic humility relates to the Kantian legacy in the early 19th century British philosophy of her day. Okay, so as a bit of background, Mary Shepard was born in 1777 into a Scottish aristocratic family outside Edinburgh, and she lived there at her childhood home, Barnborough Castle, until moving to London in 1808. So upset by the growing support of Hume in Scottish philosophy, she published her first treatise in 1824, titled An Essay upon the Relation of Cause and Effect, which mostly centers on developing a challenge against Hume's account of causality. And through this critique, she develops her own alternative necessitarian account of the causal relation. Then in 1827, she published her second treatise, which is titled Essays on the Perception of an External Universe, in which she uses the anti-Humean account of causality to construct a systematic epistemology and metaphysics that primarily accounts for our belief in the existence of an external world, self, and God. Through this work, she also deals with various other interesting topics, such as developing her own philosophy of mind and religion, as well as the philosophy of mathematics and physics. Ultimately, she envisions her project's aim as deeply theistic. In the end, her work altogether provides the antidote to what she calls Hume's skepticism of an atheistical tendency. And then subsequently to her treatises, she lastly published a few articles before she passed away in London in 1847. Okay, so now to what she says about what we can know of the external world. So Shepard's justification for our common sense belief in the existence of external things, independent of mind, centers on her particular account of causality, and more precisely how she construes the causal link between sensations and the external world. So at the heart of the kind of anti-skeptical side to Shepard's project is a defense of the claim that the nature of the relation between cause and effect informs us that our changing sensations must be partly indebted to an external cause. And furthermore, when we come to understand more about this external cause and its relation to our perceptual experience, she thinks we come to know about the deeper causal powers that inhere in the external world. So in order to make this case, Shepard makes kind of Kant-reminiscent classification of objects into two sorts: interior and exterior objects. The sensible effects of objects presented to us in experience, namely our sensations, she calls the internally existing object. Exterior objects, on the other hand, she defines as the external causes, the stuff in the world that partly produces in us interior objects, i.e. our sensations. So Shepard argues that we have an incomplete definition of object if we postulate only this kind of indubitable existence of interior objects or our sensations without acknowledging the existence of exterior objects. So I have two quotes on the handout where she puts this in her own words. First she says, an object perceived by the mind is a compound being consisting of a certain collection of sensible qualities, mixed with an idea, the result of reasoning, of such qualities being formed by a continually existing outward and independent set of its various and appropriate causes. Therefore, that there must be an outward object existing as a cause to excite the inward feeling. And of course, and then there's this other quote, she said, thus showing there are two sets of objects in nature, namely the exterior objects, the acting causes of nature, independent of the senses, the internal objects, the sensible effects of these, when meeting with the human senses and determining their specific qualities upon the mind. So Shepard thus argues that in order for our sensations to arise, to begin with, there must exist something external in the world that is responsible for producing our sensations. So the relation she conceives here between our sensations and external existence is a causal one that she formulated in her first treatise. In particular, she builds her account upon her necessitarian causal principle that necessarily every object that begins to exist is indebted to a cause external to itself for its existence. So in order to understand how she appeals to this principle, we need to understand some of the crucial reasonings behind it. As you bracket here, that I don't have quite the space to go into the depths of her account of causality. There's quite a rich secondary literature on it. It's so this is a very simplified picture. I'm going to be highlighting the kind of main features of thought that I think are most important for our purpose here today. So in very broad strokes, Shepard's account of causation builds from a rejection of Hume's characterization of causation as the succession or subsequence of empirical events. So the kind of B follows from A story. Shepard claims that Hume is right to point out that there can be no necessary connection between temporally successive empirical events. But Hume is wrong about thinking that this is what causation is. So Shepard argues that causation ought to be understood as several objects that synchronously, rather than successively, produce a distinct new third object through their union. So she writes on quote 3, a cause, therefore, is such an action of an object as shall enable it, in conjunction with another, to form a new nature, capable of exhibiting qualities varying from those of either of the objects unconjoined. This is really to be a producer of new being. This is a generation or creation, qualities not conceived of antecedently to their existence, and not merely an idea always followed by another on account of a customary association between them. So she has Hume here in mind. An effect is the produced quality exhibited to the senses as the essential property of natures so conjoined. So to illustrate what she means by causation is synchronous, she takes the example of combustion. So she writes, unquote, for fire and wood must be antecedent to combustion, no doubt. But it's in the union of fire and wood, there exists immediately combustion as a new event in nature. So from her characterization of cause and effect as synchronous rather than antecedent to one another, she infers that causes and their effect are inseparable from one another in the sense that the produced object, namely the effect, cannot arise if the objects responsible for its production were separated from one another. It arises in the kind of union of the objects. So together with what Shepard takes to be the necessary truth that an object cannot depend on itself or nothingness for its existence, she infers her causal principle. And necessarily every object whose existence has a beginning is indebted to a cause external to itself for its existence. So the dependence relation and inseparability of causes and effect that Shepard argued for, therefore lies at the center of the argument she's making here about the relation between our sensations and external objects. Our sensations are effects that must have been produced as a result of the conjunction of external causes. So another puzzle piece that is important to understand her account is her unique conception of sensation. So Shepard's usage of the term sensation is quite different, and it's very broad, denoting in fact all conscious mental states. So she writes on quote 5, I know indeed that it is usual to apply the term sensation to those perceptions only which are unaccompanied with the notion of their inhering in an outward object, as the pain arising from the incision of a sharp instrument is a sensation, which is not in the instrument. But in reality, every thought, notion, idea, feeling, and perception which distinguishes a sentient nature from unconscious existence may be considered generally as sensations. So this is a very broad notion, and then she makes subcategories within that. And in the category of perception, Shepard argues that a sensation arising from perception is a complex of qualities causally produced by the union of external objects, the mind, and senses. Here I think we find Shepard really distancing her account from the kind of naive realist picture of the Scottish school. For Shepard, a sensation is both mind-dependent and dependent on external matter, which, taking into consideration of causal theory, implies that a sensation necessarily consists of the quote, essential property of natures so conjoined. So what leads Shepard to infer her anti-skeptical knowledge of external existence thus essentially lies in characterizing external things as bearers of certain causal powers partly responsible for our sensations. But while Shepard argues that we possess internal objects partly in virtue of the existence of exterior objects, the essences of these external causes that her account relies on appear to remain unknown. So she says here, quote 6, so this is what I call her epistemic humility. She writes, the real essences of matter and mind we know not. We only know our sensations as real beings' very essences. These are the very things themselves. We know of other things which must needs exist by our sensations, but cannot conceive the nature of any essence not in our experience. So now I'm going to attempt to kind of deconstruct what I think to be kind of the main lines of reasoning that guides Shepard to this kind of pessimistic conclusion about essences. I've structured them as kind of 3 distinctive arguments, but they are very closely aligned. Like, for example, the second argument is kind of a premise in the first argument. So they are all very intertwined, but I do think there's some distinguishing features. So I've kind of categorized them as 3 different ones. But so the first, I think, main argument is for the activity of the mind and the causal relation between sensations and external world. So she tells us that sensations can only be about dependent, interrupted, and perceived existence, and that we thus lack sensations of the, quote, unperceived, independent existence, that is, the external causes themselves. And she tells us that the union of causes responsible for our sensations consists of the external world being one partial cause, which when it coalesces with our sense organs and mind, together through their union produces sensations. I think Shepard here argues that sensations cannot provide copies or exact resemblances of the external world, partly because the external world is not the sole cause responsible for our sensations. I think on this basis, Shepard creates a kind of epistemic problem that she only saw fit to respond humbly towards. So the nature of perception, according to Shepard, is such that we lack the kind of acquaintance with the external world that would allow us to infer knowledge of its essential constitution. So an important hidden second argument is kind of lingering in the background here. that knowledge can, in some Russellian sense, only come by acquaintance. So I think we find this epistemic commitment already in how she sets out her second treatise as an attempt to solve the following problem. If all we can be conscious of are mind-dependent ideas or sensations, then how can we come to know the existence of external causes, since they are not objects of our consciousness? Shepherd's argument seems to be that in order to acquire knowledge of objects, we must be conscious of them. So the relevant kind of acquaintance is consciousness. The idea then, I think, is that we cannot come to know the world's essence because it is not an object of our consciousness. What is an object of our consciousness is only the world after it has interacted with the mind and senses. So this is what she writes on quote 7. Objects before the notice of the senses are not the same things as after their acquaintance with them. And then there's also another quote where she says, when yet the organs of sense are to be used as a means of perception, there must be a modification of the objects, which must at least add something onto them, or in some way alter them from the state in which they were when existing unperceived. So another closely intertwined argument for the unknowability of essences in Shepherd is, I think, a distinction between knowing an object's relational properties versus knowing its non-relational properties. So this is not, of course, how she phrases it, but I'll show where the quotes where I kind of infer that. So where I get this from is that besides the claim that the external world can be known to exist as a causal precondition for sensations, she also crucially emphasizes that we also know that there is a proportional likeness, she says, between our sensations and the external world. So we have quote 8. Objects are, in one respect, like the ideas they create, namely in the same proportions and bearings to each other outwardly as they are inwardly. Therefore, among the observations we have of our ideas and sensations, we do perceive something else than these mere ideas or sensations. For we perceive by reason that the varieties of things are in relation to one another outwardly in the same proportion as are the inward sensations. So what Shepherd argues for here, I call her likeness principle, which is that the variety in our sensations must be the result of at least as much variety in the external things themselves in order to be able to be causally responsible for the production of our diverse sensations. So this is further due to a second necessitarian causal principle that Shepherd argues for in her first treatise, which is that similar causes will, in relevantly similar circumstances, bring about similar effects. For our purpose for understanding this epistemic humility, I think crucial to note here is the relational nature of Shepherd's likeness principle. What it tells us is that the nature of our acquaintance with the external world implies that our sensations are relationally proportionate to the external world. Nonetheless, she writes a bit longer, she writes, the reason why not any of the primary and secondary qualities of bodies relating to the 5 organs of sense be resembling in their perceived and unperceived state is because the external qualities, which are in relation to the senses and mind, require their aid to modify them. And that which is altered cannot be the same as when existing previous to alteration. But among sensations themselves, after their determination upon the mind, there may exist relations which the senses have nothing to do with, have not altered. We can indeed, by referring like effects to like causes and proportional effects to proportional causes, demonstrate thus far. But we never experience this further complete independency of outward object as an effect. So here I think we find in Shepherd's epistemology, epistemic humility is an argument for a distinction between knowing an object's non-relational, namely essential properties, versus knowing its relational properties. I think Shepherd alludes to this distinction also in the following passage. Well, 10. But although the proportional varieties of external objects may be known thus far, nevertheless, I consider it never can be too much insisted on, in order to maintain an exact philosophy, that the positive nature and essence of unperceived beings cannot be known. Feeling, thought, sensation, under its varieties, is the only essence of which we have absolute consciousness. So you also find this emphasis on consciousness. So the distinction that Shepard is urging here between knowledge of what she calls the proportional varieties of external things versus knowledge of the essence or nature of external things suggests, I think, that she thinks that there is an unjustified jump from her likeness principle, so from the idea that we can know that there's this proportional likeness between our sensation and the external world, to knowledge of its essence. So in her knowledge of the proportional likeness, what Shepard lets us into is the epistemic sphere of knowing the unperceived world's relational properties, namely the knowledge claim that there must be at least as much variety in the external world as in our sensations. But on Shepard's account of our knowledge of the external world, we can at most know that an object is a combined mass of qualities, the result of proportional unknown circumstances in nature. For Shepard, I think we therefore remain in ignorance of the essence of unperceived beings, presumably, I think, because she thinks we can only come to know of the external world's relational properties, and she takes essential properties to be non-relational. Okay, so with this kind of sketch of Shepard's account of our knowledge of the external world, and specifically this form of epistemic humility, I'm now going to reflect a little bit about how this possibly relates to the Kantian legacy. So as has been noted in the secondary literature, the conceptual similarities between Shepard and Kant are very difficult for the modern reader to look past. And we know Shepard was familiar with Kant because she mentions him in a footnote, but she does not provide references, so we don't know what her sources are, what she was reading. So because we don't quite know what she was reading, I'm going to use Kantian ideas discussed during her day more as a conceptual foil, so to conceptually relate to Shepard. More specifically, how Shepard's humble account of our knowledge of the external world kind of conceptually resonates with and also potentially builds upon Kantian ideas about the extent of our knowledge of the external world in the philosophy of her day, so in early 19th century British philosophy. Shepard's account relies on this epistemic distinction between knowing the world's existence versus knowing its essence. Her anti-Humean account of causality also allows her to further characterize exterior objects as a condition for interior objects to arise, sort of akin to Kant, one may think. So quote 11 in the first critique, where Kant writes, "We have experience of external things and not a mere imagination of outer things. Our inner experience, undoubted by Descartes, is possible only under the presupposition of outer experience." So this way of formulating exterior objects as a kind of precondition is certainly similar to Shepard. Also, this combination that we see in Shepard of this epistemic certainty in the existence of external things with this kind of epistemic humility towards their essences may at least appear similar to Kant's claim that, here I have a quote 12, "There are things given to us as object of our senses existing outside us, yet we know nothing of them as they may be in themselves, but are acquainted only with their appearances, that is, with the representations that they produce in us because they affect our senses." In the British reception of Kant during Shepard's day, we find various influential secondary debates that portray Kant's ignorance of the thing in itself as synonymous with the unknowability of essences, which is, of course, similar to what we find in Shepard. So, for example, we find this in the first English language work on Kant's critical philosophy by Anthony Willage, He also suggests that this kind of ignorance about things themselves is alluded to by Locke's position on real essences. So equating Kant's ignorance of the thing in itself with the notion of the unknowability of essences, and expressing a similarity between this view of Kant's with Locke's ignorance of real essences, can also be found. So this interpretation can also be found in Shepherd's Scottish contemporaries. So, for example, in the Edinburgh philosopher Thomas Browne, whom we know Shepherd read. So their readings of Kant appear to be kind of Lockean on two dimensions. So both the metaphysical, that essences and things in themselves are kind of taken to be the same thing, and epistemically, so what it means to know things in themselves is sort of the same as to know something akin to real essences. And so this early British Lockean depiction of Kant bears some striking conceptual parallels to Shepherd's account of our knowledge of the external world, I think. For one, I think it's interesting to remark that since Shepherd and Kant both want to maintain a, to some extent, knowable relation between ideas and the things themselves, they both face a similar worry of how to harmonize this claim with the claim that we are ignorant of things themselves. And Kant can be thought of as trying to circumvent this problem, or one of the ways he tries to circumvent this problem, by distinguishing between making positive versus negative knowledge claims. So, for example, in the Critique he writes, but it is not yet a genuine cognition if I merely indicate what the intuition of the object is not, without being able to say what is then contained in it. So one thing that I find interesting here is that I think Shepherd reasons in a very similar manner, conceptually, due to her consistent emphasis that her ignorance is of the positive nature and essence, she says. In contrast to simply saying she's humble towards nature or essence, right? She often qualifies it. So this qualification with the positive component of a statement, I think, is conceptually akin to the kind of Kantian style strategy of differentiating between making positive versus negative knowledge claims. So Shepherd writes on quote 14, perceiving that objects unperceived cannot be like perceived objects, by that very notion we do predicate something concerning unperceived objects and concerning our knowledge of them in their unperceived state, namely that they are not similar to our perception. So this claim Shepherd thinks is okay and consistent, namely this negative claim. Kant, though, something have this notorious problem of how to justify a position of metaphysical realism in light of this ignorance of the things themselves. So in light of the kind of Kantian reminiscent strategies that we see in Shepherd, there's, I think, an interesting question of how she faces, and in what way she faces this problem. So in the secondary literature, Antonia Lolordo, for example, claims that she thinks Shepherd completely avoids Kant's problem by preserving metaphysical realism. So this is a very grand topic, and I can't exhaustively explore here, but I think some brief observations can be made that I think are interesting to think about. So Kant's thing in itself we know to exist and to affect us. By contrast, it seems to me that the metaphysics of Shepherd's anti-Humean account of the causal powers inherent in the external world and her account of the relation this bears to our sensations seems to allow us to, I think, know quite a bit more about Shepherd's unperceived world, as she calls it, versus than we do of Kant's nominal world. So in contrast to Kant's claim that we only have acquaintance with external objects through appearances, I think Shepherd may be able to maintain more knowledge, for what we lack on her account is only absolute consciousness of external objects. So again, this qualification. I think Shepherd would therefore reject a kind of Kantian notion of a problematic judgment as that which can only tell us of something, such as the thing in itself might be. So for Shepherd, we know with absolute certainty the proportionality of things themselves, as well as knowing their existence and causal power. The only thing about the things themselves that Shepherd thinks we cannot be said to know is, or at least know certainly, is their non-relational constitution. Furthermore, I also think the complexity of Shepard's unique account of causality results in new knowledge about what the precise nature of the causal function of things themselves are in relation to our sensations. So beyond the knowledge that an external world must exist and affect us, her unique theory of causality justifies at least these two additional claims about the unperceived world. Both the primary and secondary qualities of perceptual experience are known to bear a structural, proportional likeness to the external world's essential constitution. And two, we know that our perceptual experience cannot entirely and exactly resemble the external world's essence. So she captures these kind of two claims in the following passage, quote 15, the last one. Thus, hard and soft, bitter and sweet, heat and cold, round and square, are therefore perceived not only to be sensations, but to be certain unknown qualities of objects independent of the mind in relation to each other, and in that state to continue to exist, ready to appear to the senses when called for. Okay, so conclusion. So Shepard's case for the unknowability of essences, so her epistemic humility, I think makes her account of our knowledge of the external world more nuanced than what has hitherto been appreciated. Furthermore, although the depths of her connection to the Kantian legacy in early 19th century British philosophy and how that's intertwined with the Lockean legacy, although that can't be exhausted here, I hope to at least have given some suggestions on how her epistemology possibly relates to certain Kantian reasonings. So while Shepard's account of our knowledge of the external world, I think certainly echoes the early 19th century British reception of Kant that she very plausibly could have been familiar with, I think that her distinctive anti-Humean account of causality could perhaps help her to infer a more closely knowable connection between the world as we experience it and the world in itself. Yeah, that's it.